Your Bible this evening to Leviticus chapter 19, verse 13. We're going to pick up our study this evening. Last week we covered the first 12 verses of this chapter, which begin with God's great call for His people to reflect His holiness. And that's a call that we need to respond to today, just as much as the Israelites needed to in this day. We also noted several practical examples of how that holiness should show up in the lives of the Israelites. It showed up in their respect for their parents and their obedience to the Sabbaths, in their treatment of other people. Perhaps most directly, their holiness would be displayed in their attitude and treatment, reverence toward God and to His name. They were to be very careful about their usage of the name of Jehovah, the name of God, and show the honor that He was due. As we continue in this section, we see some more examples of practical holiness and how us representing God should appear kind of in everyday lives, or how them representing. And I'll use it interchangeably. Okay, this is primarily to the children of Israel. We know that we're not under the law and that we aren't obligated to live according to all the ceremony and things like that. But as far as the practical application, as far as the civil instruction and the guidance of how we treat people, that hasn't changed any, right? We don't offer sacrifices, we don't burn goats and all that kind of stuff anymore. But we should still treat our neighbor well. We should still follow these instructions. And so I'm going to say us a lot this evening, where typically I may say they or the Israelites, but it applies to us just as much as it did them in a lot of these instances. So if I do that, just bear with me, I suppose. But Leviticus chapter 19, verse 13, here the Bible says, "Thou shalt not defraud thy neighbor, neither rob him. The wages of him that is hired shall not abide with thee all night until the morning." And so here we have another example of holiness being revealed by our treatment of other people. Once again, we have lessons that should be taught as little children, right? These are things I learned whenever I was tiny. Don't steal. Don't take things that don't belong to you. That seems really obvious. It seems really apparent. But we know that if things aren't spelled out and if expectations aren't clearly presented, then people are going to take advantage of situations. And people are going to take things that don't belong to them, whether it's in a big sense, taking from some big corporation, where a lot of people think, well, that's okay, it's a big corporation, they're not even going to miss it. Or it's more personal, and it's talking about, as is in our text this evening, your neighbor, right? The person who lives next to you, or the person who you interact with on a regular basis. The reality is that we shouldn't take anything that doesn't belong to us, no matter who it is. But once again, we have this lesson that should be something that's pretty easy for us to learn. The idea is very similar to what we saw back in verse 11, where it says, "Ye shall not steal." But it is more personal interactions this time. To defraud was to cheat someone in business or take advantage of someone in a secretive manner. Right? This is where you're kind of cutting corners or doing things in an unjust way, an unright way, in order to gain some advantage, to benefit from the loss of the other person, and taking from it. And that means to rob was to take something openly by force. And so that says basically, no matter how you're trying to do it, it's wrong. Taking things that don't belong to you is wrong. And so whether you try to do it secretly, in a way that nobody can detect or nobody takes note of, or you're doing it very brazenly so that everybody knows exactly what's happening, both are wrong, and both should be avoided. For the children of Israel, of course, but again, I don't think any of us would disagree that we today should be honest and that we shouldn't steal from people, right? We shouldn't take things that don't belong to us. While most people wouldn't rob someone, many do take advantage of others in more subtle and secret ways to pad their own pockets or to benefit themselves at the expense of others. How many times do you end up with the cashier giving you too much money back? Do you take it back, right? That's a small thing, and I know that sometimes there are practical reasons why that doesn't happen. Maybe you don't count your change. I don't really count my change. I just take it and try to get out of the store, usually as fast as possible. But if you go to the store and you spend $10 and you got $10 back, something's not right there. And a lot of people would say, well, it's like the Monopoly card, right? Make error in your favor. Collect $20, and so I'm better off for it. But we ought to do what's right, and it's right to not take things that don't belong to you. Just because that cashier messed up or made a mistake doesn't make it right for you to take advantage of that situation. So we ought to do what's right in the big things or in the small things, like a little bit of change that we might get back that we shouldn't have. We ought to do what's right, and and make sure that our testimony is one that reflects, again, the holiness of God. God is holy. He is righteous in every matter. And so we ought to try to follow that example in the big things and in the little things. Verse 14 lays out some more examples of how to treat others. Again, it should fall under the category of common decency. Verse 14, thou shalt not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind, but shalt fear thy God. I am the Lord. And these sections here is kind of divided up. Every 2 or 3 verses, you get that phrase again, I am the Lord. And so it kind of groups them together in similar themes or similar topics. But each time he reminds them, I am the Lord. I have the right to declare these things. I have the right to make these requirements of you. I brought you out of Egypt. I've delivered you. I've provided for you. I've done all these things. I created you. He has the authority. He has the right to make these demands and have these expectations of his people. And here, again, it is just common decency. It's wrong to curse those who can't hear it and defend themselves. It's wrong to put a stumbling block or an obstacle in the way of someone who can't see it and avoid it. That's just mean, right? That's just something that you would think, well, who would want to do that? Who would do such a thing? But again, these are specific examples of a more general application. And that general principle is that, number one, you shouldn't take advantage of someone's disability or area of weakness. And whether that's a physical disability like is mentioned here or any other, you shouldn't look to take advantage of people. We shouldn't look to benefit off of somebody else's loss. That's wrong, and we shouldn't be engaged in that. We shouldn't be involved in that. So that's one lesson, again, that is very applicable here. The other is that you shouldn't do something wrong just because you can get away with it. Well, they're deaf. They can't hear me anyway, so what does it matter if I curse them, right? What does it matter if I say something mean to them or bad to them? They don't hear it. They don't know about it. They're blind, so they can't see me doing this. They won't know who caused them to stumble and fall. They won't know anything about it. So I can get off completely free, right? Nobody's going to know. Nobody's going to find out. But there's one who we always have to remember that does know, right? God. It says, fear God. Why should I not do these things that I could get away with otherwise? Because God knows. God is paying attention. He knows everything that we say. He knows everything that we do. He knows when they curse the deaf man, when they put the stumbling block in front of the blind man. God knows these things, and God will judge. God is the defender of the defenseless. Those who can't provide for themselves, those who can't take care of themselves, God will come to their defense. God will take care of them. And so we need to understand for our own benefit, right, if for no other reason, that there will be an accounting. There will be an answer given. And so don't think that, well, I can just get away with it. I can fudge the numbers here in the books and nobody will know that I'm cheating the system or that I'm taking advantage of somebody else. God knows. And oftentimes, somebody else knows too, right? And oftentimes, you don't get away with things just like you think you would. But either way, we need to remember that God is in control and that God has established these things. And it's wrong to take advantage of people. It's wrong to use somebody else's bad situation for your profit. And so he tells his people, don't do that. Don't follow the example, again, that they might have seen in Egypt or that they might see in Canaan or in their neighboring nations once they get to the promised land. Don't follow that worldly example. Look out for other people. Take care of other people. Instead of hurting and harming, look to help in whatever way that you can. Verse 15 addresses judgment of others and applies both in the courtroom and really in everyday life as well. It is particular to the courtroom, the terminology and things that are used, but there's also a sense just in our interactions with other people. Verse 15, you shall do no unrighteousness in judgment. Thou shalt not respect the person of the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty, but in righteousness shalt thou judge thy neighbor. So we're to treat people fairly, regardless of their rank or status, and it's worth it noting that this applies across the board. I think it's interesting. Oftentimes you think of showing favoritism to the rich or the wealthy or the powerful, but this actually says don't show that to the poor either, right? And why would that be? I think one of the reasons for that is that, I don't know about you, typically I'm inclined to kind of take the side of the underdog, right? The person who is poor or powerless or helpless or those kind of things. And I might be inclined to just kind of lean things in their favor a little bit, right? Give them the benefit of the doubt rather than being absolutely fair in the things that I do. And the scriptures say, God says, don't do that. Don't show favoritism one way or the other, right? Don't show favoritism to the rich and powerful to try to get in good with them maybe and make a name for yourself or benefit in some way. But also, don't try to stick it to the rich and powerful and side with the poor when that's not the right thing to do. Now understand that this does not omit the opportunity to show mercy and grace and things like this. This is saying in a situation where you are called upon to judge fairly. Don't try to lean things one way or the other. You judge straight down the line. You judge in fairness. Now, can you show mercy to an individual? Maybe if somebody has done you wrong or you see somebody, absolutely. You don't have to say, well, you're getting what you deserve. You can show grace. You can show mercy. But when you're called upon to judge in a situation, do it fairly. Do it with honesty. Do it with integrity. And that's what he was calling on the Israelites to do. And again, this certainly applies in a legal sense, in a courtroom setting, as they would stand before judges that had been appointed and things like that. But I think it even goes to our personal interactions and our dealings with others, because it says, judge your neighbor, right? How you treat other people matters, and so we need to do so in a fair and just way. Verse 16 continues that thought by addressing the importance of honesty. Verse 16, thou shalt not go up and down as a talebearer among thy people, neither shalt thou stand against the blood of thy neighbor. I am the Lord. Strong's definition of the word translated talebearer is a scandal monger. A scandal monger. Somebody who likes to stir up some scandal, right? We call it a different name today, right? We call it gossip today. Somebody who's just looking for juicy gossip to spread. It says don't do that. Don't be like that. Don't try to benefit again off of the unfortunate situation, whether true or not, of someone else. Don't be a talebearer. Don't be a scandal monger. Don't be a gossip. Treat people in a good way. Treat people in a positive way. We shouldn't go around sharing everyone else's private business. The last part of the verse shows the responsibility of a witness to share the truth. This applies both in the negative and the positive sense. Don't be a false witness against someone and cause them to be condemned and perhaps even put to death by your false testimony, but also don't withhold testimony. If you know that someone has been wronged and there is a case where you can present the truth, don't hold back. Don't withhold that information. Be genuine. Don't allow your neighbor to suffer harm, to even shed blood, to have his blood shed, and you just sit back and don't say anything. It's the same idea as what's behind the saying when you go to oath. The truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. That's what this is saying. You speak the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. You don't fabricate things. You don't lie outright, but you also don't withhold things. If there's pertinent information, you share that. You present a true witness, a true testimony to the things that you've seen. And so honesty and integrity, truth, is something that's important to God. And again, that's not just for Israel in the Old Testament, right? That's for us today too. God still is concerned with truth. He is still the God of truth. And He's concerned that we present the truth and that we speak the truth whenever we are called upon to be a witness. The next two verses address the attitude that we should have in our dealings with others. They're lessons that Jesus taught His disciples as well. Verse 17 and 18. Thou shalt not hate thy brother in thine heart. Thou shalt in any wise rebuke thy neighbor and not suffer sin upon him. Thou shalt not avenge nor bear a grudge against the children of thy people, but thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. I am the Lord. Now, over time, the idea of this passage developed to be a little different than what we read it in the Scriptures. And the Jews came to the idea that, well, He said to love your brother, to love your neighbor. That means that we need to hate our enemy, right? And Jesus addressed this. If you remember, in Matthew chapter 5, verse 43, Jesus says, "Ye have heard that it hath been said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy." You've heard that it's been said that, but that's not what it says, is it? It says that you need to love your neighbor. It says that you need to not hate your brother, but does it say affirmatively, well, then hate your enemy? No. We need to treat everyone the same, and Jesus went into further explanation of that when He showed who our neighbor is, right? Remember the story of the parable of the Good Samaritan? That was about who is your neighbor. And Jesus went through that whole story, and at the end He said, well, who was the neighbor to this man who was hurt? This Jewish man who was traveling along the road? Who was his neighbor? Was it the priest? Nope. Was it the Levite? Nope. It was that dirty, rotten Samaritan, right? That one who the Jews wouldn't want anything to do with. He was the man's neighbor. And why was that? Was it because they were in the same neighborhood or something? No. It was because he showed mercy. He showed compassion. He showed grace and help this man who is in need. And he told us that we need to be that neighbor, that everyone is our neighbor. We ought to treat everybody in that way. And so, in essence, the whole idea that you should hate your enemy is a misnomer. It's not what the scriptures tell us, and it's certainly not what Jesus taught. He taught quite the opposite, right? Love your enemy. Do good to those who hurt you and despise you and treat you poorly. Love them. And so that's the commandment that God always had, right? It's the expectation that God always had of his people, that we are to love our neighbors, that we are to love other people. And not only that, he says to hate not your brother. Don't harbor that hatred or that ill will toward those, especially of your own household. But I think it generally applies across the board that we need to have care and concern for everyone. We also see in this section the importance of edifying and correcting one another rather than holding grudges and seeking vengeance. We're to rebuke our neighbor, it says there, and we might look at that and say, yeah, we give them the what for. We tell them all the things that they did wrong, but that's really not the idea that's behind this. It's inform them. Go and talk to them rather than getting angry, rather than seeking vengeance, rather than going and talking to everybody else about this person who's made you mad. You go and talk to that person. You confront your neighbor, not in a belligerent and hateful way, not in an aggressive and looking for a fight kind of way, but you address the situation with them and you let them know what's happened. Again, this is another thing that Jesus talked about in Matthew 18:15. He says, "Moreover, if thy brother shall trespass against thee, go and tell him his fault between thee and him alone. If he shall hear thee, thou hast gained thy brother." This is the same teaching that Jesus is saying here that we find right here in Leviticus chapter 19. A lot of times we look at the law and we think, oh, it's all about, harsh punishments, and you do anything just slightly wrong and it's off with your head, or stone them to death, or whatever the punishment is, and there's no grace and there's no mercy, and it's all just hard and cold, and that's not the case. It is just as loving and compassionate as much as the thing that Jesus taught, because a lot of what Jesus taught is found in the Old Testament scriptures. It's found in the law itself. And so we need to have that right attitude. And so if somebody has done me wrong, rather than seeking to get revenge, and rather than spreading the gossip and telling everybody else about what's happened, I need to talk to that person. I need to tell them what's going on so that we can address it and we can correct it. And a lot of times, at least in my experience, I've found that most of the time people aren't looking to insult you or hurt your feelings or doing a lot of the things that we may take in one way or the other. And most of the time that just, again, a civil confrontation, just addressing the issue and explaining what's going on, can resolve a whole lot of problems, whereas holding that grudge, getting bitter, seeking revenge, or spreading it to everybody else just makes the situation grow into something that's horrible and something that you don't want to deal with. And so, again, very practical advice, and really what we read here, again at the end there, where it says to love your neighbor as yourself, Jesus quoted that. He said that's the second greatest of all the commandments. Of all the commandments in Scripture, that's the second greatest, to love your neighbor as yourself. So Jesus thought very highly of this passage, and in a lot of ways, this is kind of the core, the root of the golden rule. Again, that's another thing that we think of the New Testament. But that's what we see here, right? Love your neighbor as yourself. And if you love your neighbor as yourself, you're going to treat your neighbor as you would want to be treated, which is the golden rule. So great instruction there that's given about how we deal with other people in our interactions. Now, the last section, we're not going to get through all of it tonight. We're going to get a couple of verses in. Deals with some of the civil laws kind of regarding everyday life among the nation of Israel and the things that they might come up against. Verse 19 says, "You shall keep my statutes. Thou shalt not let thy cattle gender with diverse kind. Thou shalt not sow thy field with mingled seed. Neither shall a garment mingled of linen and woolen come upon thee." And so here God prohibits the intentional mingling of different kinds of cattle, different kinds of crops, different kinds of clothing or garments, fabrics together. There's not any real clear indication of why he says this, right? What is there like a spiritual significance here? And therefore there's a whole lot of speculation about the spiritual significance or the other applications or practical uses that this might provide. There is some practical benefit. If you have scattered seed that you throw out, the crops aren't going to do as well because you're going to have different things being ready to harvest at different times. If you've got wheat and barley and one needs to be harvested a month before the other, how do you harvest it without destroying whatever else is there? So there is some practical use to that. the mixing of animals, interbreeding of animals between species. Again, that seems maybe to point back to creation itself. When God created everything, He made them after their kind. And that applied to the plants and the animals, right? And that they were to reproduce after their kind. And so God set up some distinctions there. And so the Israelites weren't to put aside what God had made as distinctions between these different types of animals and ignore God's rule or God's categories or different kinds in creation. The fabric thing is kind of another interesting one. Why were they not to mingle the different fabrics together, whether that was two different pieces of fabric in one garment or a mixture of linen and wool, or the two mentioned there. I guess there is some kind of fabric that's made out of a mixture of those. I don't know the details. Again, I'm not under the law. The Jews understood what they were talking about, and maybe they had a better understanding of why. I would likely speculate, since everybody likes to, that this probably is a reminder of the importance of separation, because that is what it comes down to, right? Don't mix things that are meant to be separated. And of course, the most important thing that God was interested in His people keeping separate was themselves from the ways of the world, right? Don't follow the ungodly, don't go into idolatry, don't go into witchcraft, don't go into all these different things. And that's highlighted really throughout the law. We've seen it already through the sacrifice and all the different things, the importance of separation from the world. And so I think that probably has a big part to do with it as far as the spiritual application. But there likely were some practical reasons for that, maybe that we don't fully appreciate today. We'll finish up this evening, verses 20 through 22. Deals with adultery between a man and an espoused slave woman. Verse 20, and whosoever lieth carnally with a woman that is a bondmaid, betrothed to an husband, and not at all redeemed, nor freedom given her, she shall be scourged. They shall not be put to death, because she was not free. And he shall bring his trespass unto the Lord, unto the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, even a ram for a trespass offering. And the priest shall make an atonement for him with the ram of the trespass offering before the Lord for his sin which he hath done. And the sin which he hath done shall be forgiven him. And so I'll start by saying that this is not an endorsement of slavery. Okay? There are a lot of things in the law that deal with slavery and that address various issues that might arise as a result of that. But this is not God endorsing slavery. Okay? This is God regulating something that existed very commonly in that day and in that culture, and in some places still exists today. And so it's not saying it's okay. It's just saying here's how to handle situations that arise as a result of that are common in this culture. I'll also say that this is kind of a spot where I think the King James translation maybe isn't the best. It does seem like the woman involved gets beaten while the man just brings a sacrifice. Now to us, that's kind of how it comes across, right? She gets the worst of it, he has to bring a sacrifice. In that culture, the two may not have had quite the weight that we place on them. Okay, to have to bring this sacrifice, to have to admit this sin in a public manner might have been, in their eyes, more detrimental than a beating would have been. Again, different culture, and I'm not saying one way or the other is better. I'm just saying that it's definitely different, and there seem to be two different punishments that are given. On the other hand, like I said back with the translation, where it says that she will be scourged, it's not clearly that way in the Hebrew. In the Hebrew, it's very generic, and it says punishment shall be administered, basically. An investigation made, and they will be punished. And so that's the idea that's presented. And so it may be that both of them get discouraging or whatever punishment was appropriate. The point being that they were not executed. Now, we'll see in the next chapter, adultery in a common sense between a free man and a free woman, the punishment was execution. They were to lose their life as a result of adultery because of the importance of marriage, right? That's really what that signifies, how important marriage is in God's eyes. This is a different situation, a different case, because she is a bondwoman, she is a slave. And so, as such, she was the possession of someone else, and so to execute the two of them would cause loss to that other person without him having anything to do with it. And so, that may be part of the reason why they weren't to be executed, as opposed to those who were free whenever they were caught in adultery being executed. The other thing there, again, if if they were both beaten, then nobody would have a problem with this, even though he still has to offer a sacrifice. And so that may be also the distinction there. If the woman was beaten and the man offered the sacrifice, it may be because the woman wasn't able to offer a sacrifice. As a slave, she would likely not have any possessions at all of her own. They would all belong to her master, and therefore she could not offer a sacrifice. And so the punishment would be a different form. Either way, it's understandable. And again, I don't like to have, well, I don't want to apologize for God's law, okay? God is God, and he has the right to demand whatever he demands from his law. But I know that, in our modern sensibilities, we read some of these things and we say, well, that's not fair, or that's not right, and we can become offended by that, and we shouldn't be. And there are, again, some practical reasons why it is the way that it is. But ultimately, God said, this is the punishment, this is the end result of what goes on. So what's definite is that the man was to offer the sacrifice. This was a common trespass offering, and we covered the trespass offerings with the sin offerings. So, we've been through all that. The ram was, again, one of the typical offerings that would be brought, and that dealt with the sin that had been committed and what had taken place. As far as the woman goes, it does mention that she was a bond servant, but betrothed. That means kind of like an engagement. But if she was going to be married to a free person, she would have to be given her freedom before that took place. And so that's the detail that it's talking about there. She was a bondwoman, she's betrothed, but she hadn't yet been set free in order to marry this person. So it's setting the conditions for this particular punishment, this particular sin that had been committed, and how to deal with it. And again, this is both a moral law, but it was also the civil law for the nation of Israel, and how they were to address these things in a legal way. And so that's why sometimes it gets very detailed in the particular application, because it is a legal thing. And of course we all know that legal things are very particular. And you have to be detailed, because otherwise people find those loopholes. So that was the punishment there. As I mentioned earlier, for those who were free, certainly the consequence was more severe. And we'll see that in the next chapter. All right, I think that wraps up what I wanted to cover this evening. Any questions or comments?